Hello comrades, this is General Luigi, and welcome to Let's Prepare to Play Fire Emblem Awakening. It might be tempting to think a tough woman like Sully would be the hardest character to marry off, but there are actually a few that I have even more trouble finding husbands for. One such woman is featured in this video. If you've watched my earlier videos, you probably know what I'm going to say next, but it can't hurt to say it now too, just in case someone new is watching and doesn't know the rules. As always, before I start, I feel I should remind you that I'm classifying pairings according to my personal views on what works, what doesn't, what's believable, and what isn't. You are free to disagree with me, and I wouldn't be surprised if you did, but as I pointed out in the prologue, I will not stand for flaming. Now then, let's choose an astute significant other with whom Muriel may scrutinize this world's illimitable mysteries. Muriel's supports with Kellum address the most prominent traits exhibited by the two of them. Muriel has taken an interest in Kellum's ability to seemingly disappear at any given moment. Kellum's lack of presence doesn't satisfy Muriel as an explanation for this absolutely absurd ability, especially considering that he demonstrates the ability to disappear at will. To figure out what's behind this phenomenon, Muriel decides to observe Kellum, even going so far as to constantly hold his arm so that she can keep track of him. Unsurprisingly, this makes him feel awkward. She also sets up a few measuring devices to examine what happens when he disappears. It can be inferred that additional experiments are performed between the B and A level conversations. During the A level conversation, Kellum appears to have lost his ability to disappear. Muriel proposes that his ability to disappear stems both from his own unwillingness to reach out to others and their lack of interest in him. Now that Muriel has developed a bit of a bond with Kellum, she has an easier time noticing him. During the S-level conversation, Kellum proposes to Muriel. Muriel mentions the proposal making her happy, and Kellum appears to care about her too, but the emotional aspect isn't really coming across. They get a lot of points for forming a legitimate bond, not to mention actually explaining Kellum's tendency to disappear, but the S-level conversation left me unsatisfied as far as romance is concerned. Class 2. One thing I like about Muriel's supports with Lon'qu is that they don't focus exclusively on his genophobia. Rather, we start off with Muriel being so absorbed in her research that she almost gets herself killed. Specifically, she demonstrates why it is a bad idea to walk while reading a book, and Lon'qu keeps her from falling off a cliff. Between the C and B level conversations, Lon'qu saves our absent-minded professor many more times. In the B-level conversation, Muriel reveals that the later near-death experiences were actually part of an experiment. Specifically, she wanted to examine Lon'qu's tendency to save her. If it weren't for her purely scholarly interest in this activity, I'd say Muriel was quite the troll. However, it's at this point that Lon'qu's difficulties with women are finally brought up. Between the B and A-level conversations, Muriel decides to investigate Lon'qu's condition by putting a large number of statues of women in his tent. He's not pleased, needless to say. In addition, her experiment fails to consider other possible reasons for Lon'qu's reaction. It's implied that Lon'qu is subjected to many more experiments between the A and S level conversations. Needless to say, they've also developed feelings for each other during this time. My problem is that a lot of the incidents that build up their bond, and ultimately lead to them falling in love, happen between the conversations. I can tolerate this sometimes, but with this series of conversations, I'm almost always being told rather than shown what is going on. As hilarious as the conversations can be, they don't make up for the fact that any real bond building happens off-screen. Class 1. In her supports with Rickon, Muriel arguably takes him as an assistant in her experiments with magic. I'm afraid there isn't that much to say on the matter, though. Rickon expresses a clear interest in the experiments and appears to grow fond of Muriel in the process. The two reveal something they sort of have in common in the A-level conversation. Muriel's studies are inspired by her mother's work, while Rickon is attempting to restore his family's prestige. Come S-level, Rickon has apparently fallen in love with Muriel, as he demonstrates by asking her to marry him. My problem with this marriage is that, while Muriel implies she might feel the same way, she also implies that the marriage is more for the sake of knowledge than love. It's clear from early on that Rickon admires Muriel, but other than one line in the S-level conversation, I don't pick up on any signs that Muriel thinks of Rickon as anything more than an assistant in her experiments. Class 0. Muriel's apparent detachment from life takes center stage again in her supports with Gregor. At first, Gregor's interest in having tea with pretty much every woman in the army leads Muriel to want to quantify attractiveness and come to a universal definition of it. Her effort to look into the matter is sidetracked when Gregor expresses an interest in a book he had found. As it turns out, it was one of Muriel's books that she had misplaced, and said book was written by her mother. As it also turns out, Gregor wrote many notes in the book's margins. Muriel is pleased that Gregor is so interested in it, though, and doesn't hold the annotations against him. In the A-level conversation, though, Muriel gains a particular interest in one specific note Gregor made. Specifically, he crossed out that which helps establish the theory, and replaced it with experience. Muriel's a rather extreme case, so I can agree with Gregor's view here. Muriel tries to observe everything from an objective and scientific standpoint, never experiencing it for herself. Gregor uses the example of love in the S-level conversation and proposes to Muriel. Muriel expresses a rather clear interest in casting aside her usual objective approach when Gregor proposes to her. It's pretty much the closest thing Muriel ever gives to admitting to being in love with someone. I picked up on a bond of sorts developing through their differences in approaching life, and while more attention is called to Muriel's obsession with objectivity, we also see Gregor's own willingness to be objective thanks to his interest in Muriel's book. Despite their differences, both of them are quite knowledgeable in their own ways, and that part shows itself in these supports. Class 3. Muriel's supports with Libra call attention to their differences, but also show the merit in their approaches to certain matters. Libra has always been focused on touching individual hearts with his preaching one at a time. Muriel, by contrast, believes that a more general sermon directed at a large crowd would be more efficient, and thus more effective. To test her hypothesis, she convinces Libra to temporarily abandon his one-on-one approach in favor of a preach-to-the-masses approach. As with her attempted investigation of attractiveness, however, Muriel fails to account for individuality, or, as Libra puts it, the importance of the heart. While Libra's preaching reaches more ears than ever through Muriel's approach, as he aptly puts it, the message stops at the ears. Nevertheless, he considers general preaching to be useful in helping him meet more people, making it a good first step as it gives him more people to reach out to, though he considers it important to subsequently touch hearts individually and adapt his message accordingly with each different person. Muriel expresses an interest in the intricacies of the human heart, and that leads to her accepting Libra's marriage proposal in the S-level conversation. But I don't really see any signs of a bond developing during the time leading up to the proposal. Because of this, their feelings for each other, while believable, still strike me as rushed. As such, I'm making this a Class 1 pairing. Muriel's supports with Henry mostly look into curses and how they differ from conventional magic. After Henry uses a curse to get rid of a dangerous snake, Muriel wants to study curses, and asks Henry to demonstrate several of them in order to help her understand how they work. By B level, Muriel has put together a theory based on her observations. In A level, Henry reveals that he hopes to develop a curse that can conjure children, bypassing the difficulties of pregnancy. Without a means to create new life force, though, Henry's plan is at a standstill. Muriel decides to look into possible processes herself. You can probably see where this is going. In the S-level conversation, Henry suggests that he and Muriel get married so that they could see if having a child themselves would help them figure out how to conjure one. I will grant that Henry openly admits to being smitten with Muriel at this point, but his approach bugs me immensely. As for Muriel, her observations suggest that she is at least infatuated with Henry. My main issue with this pairing is Henry's approach to the whole marriage question. It might be Henry, but come on. These two aren't implied to be nobles, so I can't even slightly get behind the idea of marrying for the sake of having a child. Their research is a nice tone for the conversations, but I cannot support them getting married. Class 0. I feel Muriel's supports with Donald focus almost exclusively on Donald's ambitions, whereas Muriel's role in these supports is, well, a supporting role. Donald, hoping to gain academic knowledge, asks Muriel to tutor him on various things that he thinks might benefit his village if he brought knowledge of such things back home with him. Muriel obliges, and Donald turns out to be an exceptional student, both eager to learn and good at retaining knowledge. You might recall him exhibiting these traits in his supports with Maribel, too. Ultimately, Donald proves himself Muriel's equal in both desire and capacity to learn. Having grown fond of his lessons, Donald suggests they start collaborating on any new studies. Though reluctant at first due to previous partners' inability to keep up with her, Muriel agrees to the arrangement. In the S-level conversation, Donald proposes to Muriel. While I love how much they turn out to have in common, the proposal and acceptance are worded in such a way that there are absolutely no signs that they are in love at that point. As such, though I'm quite fond of the idea of them becoming friends, I cannot support them as a romantic pairing. Class 0. So that's Muriel for you. Even in her better supports, her capacity to love has a great deal of trouble coming across. As always, if you want Muriel to marry someone in particular, please vote for that character by posting your vote in the comments section or sending me a private message. If you feel any of the Class 0 pairings deserve a chance, you have until 12 o'clock p.m. Pacific Standard Time this Wednesday, March 5th, to convince me to reclassify them. Now it's time to decide which of the 2 remaining women in the second group will marry Inigo, and which of them will remain single. Depending on how loyal you expect our flirtatious swordsman to be, the latter might be getting off easy in comparison. I would like to say right now that Inigo's supports with Morgan are downright hilarious, in my opinion. Inigo being Inigo, the C-level conversation starts with him asking Morgan to join him for tea, but Morgan inadvertently shoots him down by suggesting they invite some other people along. It's only after Inigo fails to convince Morgan that it should only be the 2 of them that she realizes he was asking her out. Between the C and B level conversations, Inigo attempts to go out with another woman and is shot down in a manner that leaves him feeling pretty depressed. To try to cheer him up, Morgan agrees to go on a date with him. Unfortunately for Inigo, Morgan wants the best he can afford. Between the B and A level conversations, Inigo succeeds in getting a tea date with another woman, only for said woman to spike his drink and rob him while he's unconscious. After giving Inigo an earful for fighting specifically to impress girls, yes, Inigo explicitly says he is fighting a war for them, Morgan agrees to treat him to dinner to make up for his treating her. By S level, Inigo has realized he loves Morgan, and even says he is done flirting with other ladies. As it turns out, Morgan enjoyed seeing Inigo get humiliated, but after getting visibly flustered by Inigo's confession, she agrees to be with him. In addition to the humor value, one thing I love about this pairing is just how close they are despite Morgan's tendency to make fun of Inigo. Perhaps it's because they're both so silly that I like the idea of them becoming a couple. Class 3. Inigo's supports with Na are also funny, though they also have a more serious tone in several spots. She suggests that his tendency to flirt with just about everyone comes off as disrespectful. In her own words, it's little wonder some get violent when they learn that they're just one among hundreds. Inigo has trouble learning his lesson, though, and when Na suggests that he'd be more successful if he wasn't such a philanderer, he dismisses her on account of her apparent age and inexperience. She does look like a child, after all. He apologizes between the B and A level conversations, but in the A level conversation, Na decides to drive home her point that she's not a child by transforming into a dragon when she's right next to him. When the S-level conversation rolls around, Inigo says that, for the sake of his well-being, he has stopped flirting. It's at that point that Na decides to marry Inigo and serve as his lifetime chaperone. Inigo doesn't get a choice in the matter. Na doesn't give him a chance to object, acting as though they are already married, and that Inigo's reluctance is a sign that he hasn't learned his lesson and should thus be eaten. It's supposed to be played for laughs, and I can definitely laugh at the conversations, but it's only funny to someone looking in from the outside. I can't force Inigo into a marriage he expresses no interest in. Class 0. No contest, right? The winner in this case is obvious unless someone talks me into reclassifying the second pairing and said pairing gets more than 3 times the amount of votes the first pairing gets. Still, if you want me to reclassify it, you have until 12 o'clock p.m. Pacific Standard Time this Wednesday, March 5th, to convince me to do so. The polls for choosing Muriel's husband and Inigo's wife will close at 12 o'clock p.m. Pacific Standard Time this Saturday, March 8th, which also happens to be International Women's Day. With the end of this pair of elections, we will only have 3 people left to choose spouses for. I will see you next time.